The year was 1903, and the small Kentucky town of Waverly rested in a hush that felt older than time itself. It was a place wrapped in morning fog and church bells, where the dirt roads wound between tobacco fields and the river carried more than just water. It carried whispers. The people there lived simple lives. Men rose before dawn to tend their farms, women kept their homes warm with biscuits and black coffee, and children ran barefoot through the fields until the sun dipped behind the hills. But that summer the calm felt thinner than usual. The air carried something uneasy, like a storm waiting to break. The town's heart was its square, a cluster of old brick buildings, a courthouse clock that never struck the right hour, and a general store where everyone came not just for supplies but for gossip. Behind the store, a gravel road curved toward a stretch of farmland that belonged to one of Waverly's oldest and wealthiest families. The man who owned it was respected, even feared a little. He came from money that stretched back before the war, and though he was polite in public, people said his eyes held a kind of coldness that never matched his smile. His family name carried weight, but in quiet corners, some whispered it also carried secrets. His wife, younger by almost 20 years, was the kind of woman people couldn't stop talking about. She was beautiful in a way that didn't belong to Waverly, too polished, too fine for a place where most women worked with their hands. She had come from somewhere north, a city girl who found herself in a world of barns and back roads. In town, people said she seemed restless, like someone waiting for something, or someone, that never came. She was kind, soft-spoken, but when she looked away, there was something in her eyes that made you wonder what she was thinking. They lived in a house that stood on a hill just outside town, with tall white columns and a porch that wrapped around like an arm guarding what was inside. On clear nights, you could see the glow of their oil lamps through the trees. The servants said the house was always too quiet, like sound itself didn't dare linger there. Some nights, the wife could be heard playing piano late into the dark, the melody floating down the hill like a memory. But on other nights, there were raised voices, low, sharp, and ending too suddenly. No one ever spoke of it openly. In Waverly, people minded their business, even when it burned at the edges of their curiosity. There was another man, too, a farmhand, quiet and strong, who worked the property since he was a boy. He was loyal, always the first to arrive, the last to leave. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words carried weight. People said he had a kind soul, though he kept it hidden beneath the hard shell of work and sweat. He had a way of watching people, of noticing small things others missed. And lately, he had been noticing a lot. Small changes in how the lady of the house moved, how she smiled less, how her hands sometimes trembled when she thought no one was watching. Then there was the preacher, a tall man with hollow cheeks and a voice that could fill a church like thunder. He had been close with the family for years, guiding them through sermons about faith and forgiveness. But behind closed doors, he too had his own sins to wrestle with. He believed he was helping them, bringing light to a household that seemed to grow darker by the day. But sometimes light, when it shines on the wrong place, only shows what people were trying to hide. Life in Waverly moved at its usual pace that summer, until small things began to feel off. The servants whispered about strange noises coming from the cellar. A horse was found wandering near the woods, its reins snapped clean through. A letter meant for the wife arrived torn open. And the husband, once calm and collected, started leaving town for long stretches, coming back with liquor on his breath and a temper that scared even his own dogs. The town still looked the same from the outside, same church bells, same children playing in the dust. But something unseen had started to take root. It was in the way people lowered their voices when passing the big house, the way the wife stopped attending Sunday service, the way the preacher's eyes darted toward the family pew that now sat empty. No one could say exactly when the peace of Waverly began to crack. But by the time the leaves started to turn that autumn, people could feel it in their bones, that something terrible was waiting just out of sight. And when it came, it wouldn't just shatter one family. It would leave a stain on the town so deep that, even 100 years later, people would still whisper about the summer of 1903, the year Waverly learned that evil doesn't always come with a warning. Sometimes it grows quietly in the house on the hill, behind a locked door, beneath the sound of a piano playing softly into the night. By the end of summer, the calm rhythm of Waverly had changed. The air around the big house seemed heavier, and even from the road below, people said you could sense something wrong about it. The laughter that once drifted from the porch during evening gatherings had stopped. The wife no longer played her piano, and the husband's carriage no longer returned home at predictable hours. Inside, small moments began to twist into something darker, glances that lingered too long, words said under breath, and silence that carried more meaning than speech ever could. The husband had started drinking more, and when he did, his voice grew louder, his hands more impatient. He slammed the doors hard enough to shake the glass and curse at things that didn't matter. A missing cufflink, a burnt roast, a newspaper headline about falling crop prices. His pride once his armor had turned into his prison. The tobacco business wasn't doing as well as it used to, and rumors about debts had begun to circle. For a man like him, being seen as weak was worse than ruin. And yet that's exactly how he felt, losing control over his land, his money, and his wife. She felt it too, the way he looked at her had changed. His affection had turned into suspicion, and his silence felt like judgment. Every move she made seemed to offend him. If she stayed quiet, he called her cold. If she smiled at someone in town, he called her shameless. Sometimes she'd find him standing at the doorway just watching her, eyes narrowed, jaw set, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't understand. He'd never accuse her outright, not yet, but his questions always came sharp and without warning. "Where were you this afternoon? Who sent that letter? Why'd you take so long at the store?" The farmhand noticed it all but kept to himself. He'd seen the wife cry behind the stable one morning when she thought no one was around. He wanted to speak, to tell her that she didn't deserve the way things were turning, but words caught in his throat. He'd always known his place. He was the help, not family, not friend. Yet lately she'd started talking to him more, asking about the crops, the animals, even small things like the weather. But sometimes her voice softened, almost trembling as if she was trying to say something else. One afternoon she'd handed him a book, a small thing she said she didn't want anymore. Inside, tucked between the pages, he found a note written in her hand. Just 3 words, "I feel trapped." He didn't know what to do with that. He hid the note, but it burned in his pocket for days, as if her pain had become his own. Soon after, the husband began assigning him extra tasks, things that kept him far from the house. Fixing fences at the far edge of the property, clearing brush along the river. It was his way of drawing a line, of saying stay away. The farmhand obeyed, but each day he grew angrier, not just at the man's cruelty, but at himself for being powerless to stop it. Meanwhile, the preacher had become more involved in the family's affairs. The husband called him often, inviting him for supper or private talks in the study. He sought counsel under the guise of faith, but what he really wanted was validation, that his anger was righteous, that his suspicions were justified. The preacher tried to calm him, reminding him that jealousy was a sin, but inside, he too wrestled with temptation. He'd always admired the wife's kindness, her quiet grace. When she came to church alone one Sunday, eyes downcast, he felt something stir in him that had nothing to do with God. He told himself he was there to help her, to guide her, but his visits to the house became more frequent than any pastor's duty required. The servants began to notice strange patterns. The husband's carriage would leave before dawn and return after midnight. The preacher would arrive on horseback when the husband was away. The wife started locking her door at night, something no woman in Waverly had ever done before. Once, one of the maids claimed to hear crying coming from the study, followed by a sound that made her blood run cold, a gun being cocked, then silence. She told no one but packed her bags and left the next morning. Money trouble grew worse as autumn came. The husband's investments had failed, and he owed more than he dared admit. He began selling land quietly to men in nearby towns, hoping no one would notice, but people talk in small places, and soon the whispers reached his wife. She asked him about it one evening over dinner, her voice soft, almost afraid. He didn't answer at first, just stared at her across the table, eyes dark. Then in a low, measured tone, he said, "You let me handle what's mine." That was the night she stopped eating at the table altogether. The farmhand, restless and guilt-ridden, couldn't stay away. One late evening, he rode back to the property under the pretense of checking the stables. The moon was low, and the house glowed faintly through the mist. He saw her standing by the porch, barefoot, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked fragile in that pale light, but when she turned to him, her eyes were sharp, desperate. She whispered that she couldn't live like this anymore, that he was watching her, following her every move. She begged him to leave town before the husband found a reason to ruin him, but he refused. He told her he wouldn't go, not while she was still there. That moment, brief and trembling, was the beginning of the end. After that night, everything began to move faster. The husband found footprints by the garden that didn't match his own. A servant claimed to see the farmhand near the porch again. And one morning, a rumor reached him. Someone had seen his wife near the preacher's home after sunset. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The thought alone was enough to ignite him. He began carrying a revolver everywhere he went, even around the house. He'd walk through each room as if inspecting for ghosts, his footsteps echoing long after he'd gone. The preacher, sensing danger, tried to distance himself, but it was too late. His own conscience had become tangled in the family's turmoil. He couldn't sleep, couldn't preach without feeling like a liar. One night he wrote a letter to the wife, part apology, part confession, and left it near the church altar for her to find. But someone else found it first. By early November, the weather turned cold, and with it came the breaking point. The husband's rage had curdled into something that no longer needed reason. He fired half his staff, locked the rest of the house, and forbade anyone from entering the main rooms without his say. The wife spent her days in silence, her nights listening for footsteps. The farmhand stopped coming altogether, afraid but torn apart inside. And the preacher, he vanished from his home for 2 days. When he returned, his hands trembled too much to hold a Bible. Everyone in town could sense it now, the weight of something about to happen. The house on the hill had gone dark, its windows blacked out, its gates shut. The milkman said the husband's eyes looked wrong, like he'd seen something unholy. Children refused to go near the road that led to the property. And late one night, a scream was heard echoing down the hill, carried on the wind toward the town square. By morning, the fog hung thicker than ever. The servant said the master never came down for breakfast. The wife's room was locked from the inside, and the piano, which hadn't been touched in months, played a single note before going silent again. Something terrible had finally broken in Waverly, and the house that once stood as a symbol of pride now waited in silence, hiding the truth of what happened behind its tall white columns and blood-stained walls. The night it happened, the air was cold enough to bite through the skin. A hard frost had settled over Waverly, coating the tobacco fields in a thin layer of white. The moon hung low, pale and watchful, as if it knew what was about to come. Inside the big house on the hill, the silence was so deep it felt alive. Each creak of the wooden floor, each whisper of wind against the shutters carried the weight of something waiting to happen. The husband had been awake all night. He sat in the study, the fire burning low, a half-empty glass of whiskey beside him. His revolver rested on the desk, close enough for his fingers to brush against the cold metal now and then. He hadn't slept in days. His mind ran in circles, replaying every glance, every word, every unanswered question. The letter found in the church had torn through whatever sanity he had left. It wasn't signed, but he recognized her handwriting, the delicate loops, the trembling strokes, and the words, God, those words, "Forgive me for what I've done." He read it until the paper tore in his shaking hands. Forgive her for what? His thoughts twisted like wire, each one cutting deeper than the last. The preacher's face flashed in his mind, the farmhand, too. The idea of them with her talking, touching, conspiring, burned through him until it was all he could see. Jealousy wasn't even the right word anymore. It was madness. It filled his chest until he could hardly breathe. He poured another drink, but the shaking didn't stop. Upstairs, his wife stood by the window, staring out into the black fields. She hadn't slept either. Her hands trembled as she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She knew he'd found the letter. She could feel it in the way the house had gone quiet, in the way his footsteps no longer moved through the halls. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen. The letter wasn't a confession. It was a plea for peace, for forgiveness for the thoughts she couldn't control. But now it was too late. He'd read it the way angry men read everything, with their pride, not their hearts. She heard a sound downstairs, a door slamming shut. Then his voice, muffled but harsh, calling her name. It wasn't the voice of a husband anymore, it was something else. She backed away from the door, her breath quickening. The walls of the room seemed to close in, and her heartbeat pounded so loudly she could barely think. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The servants were gone, the house too far from town for anyone to hear her cry for help. Her only thought was to get outside, out into the cold, into the dark, anywhere but here. She slipped out through the back staircase, her bare feet silent against the steps. The air hit her like ice as she stepped out onto the porch. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Then came the sound she feared most, the heavy thud of his boots behind her. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice was low, steady, and terrifying in its calmness. She turned slowly. He stood in the doorway, gun in hand, his eyes empty. The wind lifted his coat slightly, revealing the trembling of his fingers, the tightness of his jaw. For a long moment, neither spoke. "Please," she whispered. "You're mistaken, I haven't done anything." "Don't lie to me," his voice cracked like a whip. "Not now, not after everything." She shook her head, tears streaking down her face. "You don't understand, I just wanted to leave. I couldn't live like this anymore." "Leave," he stepped closer, the boards creaking under his boots. "And go where? To him? To them?" He raised the gun and her knees nearly gave out. She tried to speak, but no sound came. In that instant, she saw not a husband, not even a man, but something hollowed out by anger and fear. His hand trembled as he took another step closer. Inside his head, the world had collapsed into noise. Her voice, the preacher's sermons, the sound of the piano, the whispers of the townsfolk, all twisting together into a storm he couldn't silence. The gun felt heavy in his hand, but it was the only thing that gave him a sense of control. He wanted her to explain, to beg, to make sense of the pain clawing at him. But she just stood there, eyes wide and full of something that looked too much like pity. "Don't look at me like that," he said through his teeth. "Don't you dare." She took a step forward, one trembling hand raised. "I'm not your enemy," she said softly. "You can still stop this." But her words didn't reach him. They were lost in the roar inside his mind. He pulled the trigger. The sound split the night like thunder. Birds scattered from the trees. For a moment he didn't realize what he'd done. She was still standing, still staring at him, until her knees buckled and she fell backward onto the porch. The white wood beneath her darkened quickly, the frost melting where her blood spread. He dropped the gun. The world went quiet, too quiet. His breath came in short, sharp bursts as he stared down at her. Her hand twitched once, reaching toward him, then fell still. He knelt beside her, shaking, his fingers brushing her hair from her face. "No," he whispered, over and over, as if saying it enough times could undo what had just happened. "No, no, no." The reality of it hit him all at once, the smell of gunpowder, the weight of the silence, the red pooling around her. He felt sick, his body trembling uncontrollably. He hadn't meant to kill her. He just wanted to scare her, to make her see how much she'd hurt him. But now the house was still, and the only sound was the wind scraping against the porch. He stumbled back into the study, eyes wild, searching for something, anything, to make it right. The whiskey glass lay shattered on the floor. The letter still sat on the desk, torn and wrinkled. He stared at it, then at the revolver, and for a brief, terrible moment he lifted it toward his own head. But his hand froze. Fear, cowardly, sharp, overpowered guilt. He couldn't end it, not yet. He went back to her body, covered it with his coat, and dragged her inside. The effort left him gasping, his face slick with sweat despite the cold. He laid her down in the parlor, arranging her as though she were sleeping. Then he began to clean. He wiped the floor, the doorframe, the porch boards, though his hands shook so badly that he missed spots. When he finally looked at her again, the weight of what he'd done crashed down in full. By morning, the fog had thickened, swallowing the hill. The husband sat alone in the parlor, the revolver on the table beside him, his clothes stained and his eyes vacant. He'd locked every door, drawn every curtain. Outside, the farmhand arrived, drawn by the stillness of the property. He called out, but no one answered. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic ticking of the broken clock inside. When he finally pushed open the door, the air smelled of iron and smoke. The sight that met him froze him where he stood, the woman he'd tried to save lying pale and lifeless, the man who'd destroyed her sitting beside her like a ghost. The farmhand backed away slowly, his stomach twisting, his mind refusing to believe what his eyes saw. "Get out," the husband rasped, voice hoarse. "You have no place here." But the farmhand didn't move. He looked at the woman one last time, his chest aching with something too deep for words. Then he turned and ran. By the time the sun rose, the news had begun to spread. People said they heard 2 gunshots that night, not one. Others swore they saw the preacher's horse tied near the house. No one knew the truth, not then, not even after the sheriff arrived. But one thing was certain, the house on the hill had become something else entirely, a place cursed by what happened within its walls. And inside, the man who'd once been proud and untouchable sat alone beside his wife's body, whispering her name until his voice broke, knowing he'd destroyed the only thing he'd ever truly loved. The morning after the murder, Waverly woke to a silence that didn't belong to it. The fog still hung low over the town, swallowing the fields and blurring the edges of the road that led to the big house on the hill. People noticed that no smoke rose from its chimney, that the milk cart returned untouched, and that the dogs hadn't barked once all morning. By noon, a farm boy sent to deliver eggs came running back down the road, pale and shaking, saying he'd seen something terrible through the parlor window. Within an hour, the sheriff was on his way. Inside the house, the husband sat where they found him, slumped in a chair near his wife's body. His clothes were stiff with blood, his eyes distant, staring past the room, past the men crowding the doorway, past even himself. He didn't move when they called his name. He didn't speak when they asked what happened. Only when the sheriff reached for his gun did he flinch, muttering under his breath, something about forgiveness, about God, about how she wouldn't stop looking at him even now. They led him away like a man already half dead. The sight of the wife's body spread through town faster than anyone could have imagined. By sundown, every porch and parlor in Waverly buzzed with whispers. Some said he killed her out of jealousy. Others claimed she'd been planning to run away. A few even whispered that the preacher had been involved. The story grew with each telling, like a vine wrapping itself tighter around the truth until it was impossible to see what was real anymore. The sheriff, a quiet man who'd known the husband since they were boys, did his best to hold back the flood of gossip. But it was no use. The murder was too shocking, too close to home. The husband, once a pillar of the town, a man of land and legacy, was now a killer. The woman who'd seemed too graceful for this place had become a ghost people couldn't stop talking about. When the preacher arrived that evening, his face ashen, the crowd outside the courthouse turned to watch him. He didn't speak to anyone, just walked straight through the doors. Inside, he asked to see the husband. The sheriff hesitated, but something in the preacher's eyes, something broken, made him step aside. In the cell, the two men sat in silence for a long while. The husband finally lifted his head. "You knew," he said, his voice hoarse. "You knew what she was." The preacher shook his head slowly. "I knew she was kind, I knew she was lonely, that's all." The husband laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "You can tell that to God, I already told him my side." The preacher wanted to speak, to say something about mercy or repentance, but the words wouldn't come. All he could see was the woman's face, pale and still on that parlor floor, and the blood that had soaked through her dress. He'd prayed for her soul the entire night, but deep down, he feared his prayers meant nothing. Some sins, he thought, were too heavy for words. The trial came quickly. Waverly was too small to keep a scandal quiet for long. People crowded into the courthouse, pressing against the windows, whispering about the man they once admired. The husband sat silent throughout the proceedings, his hands folded neatly on the table. When asked to speak, he simply said, "I lost everything that made me human." It wasn't a defense, it was the truth. The farmhand testified too, his voice low and unsteady. He told the court what he knew, that the wife had been frightened, that she'd asked him to leave, that he hadn't listened. When the prosecutor suggested there been something improper between them, he didn't argue. He just stared at the floor and said, "She deserved peace. That's all I ever wanted for her." The jury didn't care much about motives. They only saw the blood, the gun, the letter. The verdict was expected, guilty. But when the judge read the sentence, life in prison instead of death, half the town gasped. Some said it was too merciful. Others thought it fitting that letting him live with what he'd done was punishment enough. When they led him away, he didn't resist. He only asked one thing, that she be buried on the hill facing east, where the sun would touch her first each morning. The funeral drew more people than any church service Waverly had ever seen. The preacher spoke softly, his words trembling like candlelight. He said she was a woman caught between love and fear, and that in the end, neither had saved her. Her coffin was lowered into the cold earth beneath the oak tree that overlooked the fields. The husband's name was never spoken aloud, not even once. In the weeks that followed, the house on the hill stood empty. The servants refused to return, saying they heard footsteps at night or saw a light in the parlor where she'd died. The piano played once, they claimed, one soft note like a sigh. The farmhand left town not long after. Some said he joined a logging camp in the mountains. Others said he couldn't live with the memories and took his own life. No one really knew. The preacher stayed, though he was never quite the same. His sermons grew quieter, more sorrowful. He stopped preaching about sin and punishment and spoke instead about forgiveness, about how it was the hardest thing God ever asked of anyone. People noticed his hands trembled when he held the Bible. They noticed, too, that he never again visited the road that led to the hill. As for the town, life went on, but something in it had changed. The murder had peeled away the comfort of innocence Waverly once had. People looked at each other differently, spoke in shorter tones, trusted less. The house became a symbol of pride gone rotten, of love turned to obsession, of how fast good men could fall. Mothers told their children not to wander near it after dark. Travelers passing through would ask about it, and someone would always say, "That's where the tragedy happened," before falling silent. Years later, when the husband finally died in prison, the news barely reached town. Only the preacher attended his burial, standing alone beside a simple wooden cross. The rain fell steady that day, soaking through his coat, but he didn't move until the grave was filled. He whispered a prayer, not for the man, but for the souls of everyone the crime had touched, including his own. By then, the story had become something else. A ghost tale told around fires, a warning about love and power and the way darkness grows inside people when they refuse to face their pain. But for those who'd lived through it, it wasn't just a story. It was a scar, quiet and unhealed, stretching across the heart of Waverly, Kentucky, a reminder that evil doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it's born in the places we call home, waiting behind familiar doors until the night it finally steps into the light. When the dust finally settled, the shape of what had happened became clear in the law's cold light. The husband was tried and found guilty of murder. The town had watched every step of the process. People who had once tipped their hats to him now turned their faces when he walked by. The judge gave him life in prison. Some in Waverly said the sentence was too soft. Others thought it was right that he live with what he had done day after day until his last breath. Either way, the law had spoken and the punishment was fixed. It did not bring her back. It did not fix the lives broken by what he had done. It only answered the question the town could not leave to gossip. Guilt, in the end, must stand before a judge. The preacher never escaped the stain of that winter. He kept his place in the church, but he lost something no sermon could return. People still came to hear him speak, but their eyes watched him now as much as his words. He had hoped that kindness or faith could smooth things over. Instead, his silence and the small betrayals he had allowed made him part of the story that hurt them all. He spent years trying to make amends the only way he knew, by tending to the broken, speaking softer truths, and admitting more of his own mistakes from the pulpit. Some forgave him. Some never did. The thing that followed him most was not an accusation anyone shouted in the street. It was the quiet suspicion that even good men can fail when they think themselves stronger than their own needs. The farmhand left Waverly within the year. He carried with him a few coins and a load of hurt. He never returned to the house on the hill. For him, the life he had known was finished, ended by a night he could not change. People said he joined work farther away, where the trees were thick and the roads were long. Some said he found a place where the past did not follow so closely. Others could not imagine forgiveness for a town that had once looked to him as a simple helper. The truth was quieter. He lived with what he had seen and could not forget, and that weight reshaped who he became. He learned that silence can cover things, but it can also eat at a person from the inside out. The house itself stood empty for years. Its windows stared like unblinking eyes. Children dared each other to run past it in summer and told ghost stories there in winter. The piano stayed silent most days, though once in a while a traveler would say they'd heard a note, soft as breath, come from behind the curtains. The family that had owned it moved from the town's memory into its warnings. Wealth and name could not shield a man from the fall that came when his worst self took hold. What remained was a lesson in plain view. Standing can hide danger when people are too slow to look deeper. Waverly changed in ways that were not easy to count. Some people held tighter to old loyalties, refusing to believe that a neighbor could be both loved and dangerous. Others let their lives be remade by the fear that had slipped into their days. Mothers watched their daughters with a new sharpness. Men who once joked over whiskey sat longer in silence, troubled by how quickly anger could push a man beyond reason. The town's stories grew, as stories do, and with each retelling some pieces slipped into myth. The facts, the gun, the letter, the trial remained. But the shape of the tragedy took on meanings beyond itself, a warning about pride, a lesson about the cost of control. Beyond the faces and fences, the case nudged a harder discussion into the sunlight. It forced talk about who had power and how they used it. The husband had been a man of money and status. For a long time, his word had been heavy in the town. That weight made some people hesitate to look too closely at his life when he first began to falter. Others saw in his downfall how easily society could put certain lives above others, how a woman's pleas could be small in the noise made by men with land. The trial did not rewrite those truths, but it pushed people to ask them out loud. It made some question how quickly they judged by appearances and how often they protected reputation over safety. There was also a quieter, harder truth about how women lived in that time. The wife's choices were narrow. Her leaving would have meant shame, ruin, or worse. Her asking for help was dangerous in a world where a man's anger could be law in his own home. That reality did not excuse the violence done to her, but it explained why escape seemed impossible most nights. It made the town face the need for more than gossip. What they needed was a way to listen when someone said they were afraid, and to act before the fear turned into death. The case taught the few who would listen that cruelty often wears a polite face, and that power without mercy can destroy the people it should protect. Many years later, the raw edges of the event softened, but the memory never left. Old men told the story to younger ones, not to glorify it but to pass on a warning. The preacher, gray and quieter now, would sometimes walk by the grave and stand for a minute. He never spoke of the man's last days in prison. He spoke instead of the cost of small sins and the value of truth. He would say that people hurt in different ways, that apology without action buys little. He learned slowly to name his part and to listen when others asked for help. That, he came to believe, was the only way to make sure the harm had not been wasted. Justice in the formal sense had been served when the judge placed the sentence on paper. But justice in the human sense was more complicated. The husband paid with his freedom, but he kept his guilt every waking hour. The wife's grave kept a silence that law could not fill. The town carried its own punishment in the way people's eyes changed at the mention of the house on the hill. In that way, justice spread out beyond prison walls into the life of a place that could never be exactly the same. Some called that fair, some called it only the shape of loss. Still, there was room for a quieter kind of hope. The few people who chose to change their ways after the tragedy did small things that mattered. They built a safer road for those who feared crossing the town at night. They sat more often with their friends, and they listened. Daughters were given chances to learn work that could help them stand on their own if they needed to. The preacher pushed more for kindness that looked like action, not merely pity. In time, Waverly learned to protect its weak in ways it had not known before. It was not a clean victory. It was slow, and it arrived only after loss had made the cost of indifference plain. When people asked what the story meant, answers came in many shapes. Some said it was a tale about how power corrupts. Some said it was about jealousy and how it can grow into violence. Others said it spoke of the quiet harm that comes from not listening. All of these were true. The tragedy was not simple, and nothing in its end made every wrong right. But it taught the town to look longer at its own heart and to name the ways people could hurt one another even when they wore good faces. In the end, the house on the hill remained a place that asked questions. It asked how much people would protect their honor over a neighbor's life. It asked what a town owes its women and its poor. It asked whether forgiveness was something given or something earned. Answers did not come all at once. They took years, slow changes, the small acts of people who decided to be different. The story stayed with Waverly, held in its fields, spoken by the wind that crossed the hill, and in the quiet at the church porch after a long Sunday sermon. That is what the town passed on, a memory that was painful and a lesson that grew out of it. People still told the tale, not to keep the wound open, but to keep themselves honest. They wanted to remember that behind every scandal is a human life, and behind every life are choices that lead to ruin or to repair. In that remembering, perhaps the most lasting thing the tragedy left was a warning. Look closely, listen longer, and let kindness be louder than pride.